until 1830, when a surprising discovery was made in northern Iraq.
In Sennacherib's palace in the city of Nineveh, archaeologists found a hexagonal prism made of baked clay with an inscription in Akkadian. In the inscription, Sennacherib, the great conqueror, commemorates his military campaigns, including his expedition to the land of Judea and Jerusalem. Sennacherib boastfully presents himself in the opening sentences. I am Sennacherib, the great king, the mighty king, king of the world.
Causing them to retreat to Nineveh. In this video, we're going to begin exploring the Assyrian retelling of this event, which is found on Sennacherib's Prizm. This Prizm recounts the military campaigns of this king. The first three military campaigns which are discussed on the Prizm are firstly his campaign against Babylon, secondly his campaign against the Kassites, and then thirdly his campaign against cities within Judah. In this video, we'll only be considering his first and third campaign against Babylon and Judah. So let's begin by discussing his first campaign against Babylon, and let me give you some background information. So when Sennacherib became the king of Assyria, both Merodach-Baladan of Babylon and King Hezekiah of Judah both revolt against Assyria. Sennacherib, in response, heads down to Babylon to squash the rebellion and to retake the throne from Merodach-Baladan. Upon Sennacherib's Prizm, we read, quote, "In my first campaign, I accomplished the defeat of Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylonia, together with the army of Elam, his ally, on the plain of Kish. In the midst of that battle, he deserted his camp, and he escaped alone, so he saved his own life. The chariots, horses, wagons, mules, which he left behind at the beginning of the battle, my hands seized." End quote. So, according to the Prizm, Sennacherib is able to defeat Merodach-Baladan and retake the throne in Babylon. Alright, let's now discuss Sennacherib's third campaign against the cities of Judah. Now, it's important to note that Sennacherib doesn't at first attack Judah's capital of Jerusalem. Rather, Sennacherib tells us he first attacks the city of Sidon. On the Prizm, we read the following, quote, "In my third campaign, I went against the Hittite lands. Lul, the king of Sidon, the terrifying splendor of my sovereignty overcame him, and far off into the midst of the sea he fled. There he died." End quote. Sennacherib then goes on to list all the cities he destroyed in this region, including Joppa, Ashkelon, Beth Dagon, and Ekron. The Prizm goes into quite a bit of detail about what happened in the city of Ekron. The Prizm writes that when Sennacherib began attacking Ekron, both Egypt and Ethiopia came to their aid and fought against the Assyrians. Quote, "Their hearts became afraid, and they called upon the Egyptian kings, the bowmen, chariots, and horses of the king of Mahulia, Ethiopia. A countless host, and these came to their aid. In the neighborhood of El Teka, their ranks being drawn up before me, they offered battle." End quote. Now, why is the fact that Sennacherib mentions Egypt and Ethiopia's involvement in this crisis so important? Well, because if you watch my previous video, you know that the Bible also mentions the involvement of Egypt and Ethiopia. Isaiah 37:9 told us that Pharaoh Taharka of Ethiopia came to the aid of Judah's defense. Thus, because Sennacherib's Prizm likewise mentions Egypt and Ethiopia's involvement, it validates this part of the biblical story. Alright, everything so far has just been background information. Let's now move on to the main event, which is when Assyria begins its siege of Jerusalem. Sennacherib writes upon his Prizm, quote, "As for Hezekiah the Judahite, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small towns in their area, which are without number, by leveling with battering rams, and by bringing up siege engines, and by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels, and breaches, I besieged and took them. 200,150 people, great and small, male and female, horses, mules, asses, camels, cattle, and sheep, without number, I brought back from them and counted as spoil. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. I threw up earthworks against him. The one coming out of the city gate, I turned back to his misery." In addition to the 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, gems, antimony, jewels, large Canadians, ivory inland couches, ivory inland chairs, elephant hides, elephant tusks, ebony, boxwoods, all kinds of valuable treasures, as well as his daughters, his harem, his male and female musicians, which he brought after me to Nineveh, his royal city, to pay tribute and to accept servitude. He dispatched his messengers." End quote. So, to briefly summarize Sennacherib's Prizm, it claims that Sennacherib shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, then extracted an enormous amount of tribute payment from him, and then finally the king of Assyria returned home to Nineveh.
Because of time constraint in this channel, I cannot go into detail more about the biblical archaeological discoveries. The Sennacherib Prizm it's really interesting. There are actually three. The one that is in focus is really the one at the layered prism that is found in the British Museum. That's the one that's most publicized, the writing of which. And there are two more. One in Chicago, and the third one I forgot where it was. And it's fascinating that it does not, on the surface, it seems to contradict the biblical account of Sennacherib's besiegement of Jerusalem. He did besiege Jerusalem but did not capture. For some reason, he just packed up and went home. And we read of it in the biblical account in Isaiah and also 2 Kings that God said in reply to King Hezekiah's prayer that the Sennacherib, the Assyrian army, will not enter Jerusalem, that Jerusalem will be free, even though they were outside threatening that Sennacherib would pack up and go home and he will die in Nineveh, which came true. And there are many accounts, and even as they were packing up to go home, the biblical account says that the angel of the Lord during the night killed 185,000 of the Assyrian army. And Herodotus wrote about it. Herodotus said mice came in and caused the deaths, whatever those mice were. Herodotus said the mice ate all these organic material of the war weapons, and therefore the Assyrians couldn't fight anymore, had to go home. And besides, they came and saw that there was no water, and there was water inside Jerusalem, so they were able to last out the siege. And all Sennacherib could say was, well, I left the king of Judah inside the city like a caged bird to save face.